Yuji is a character that I didn't think too much of at first. I'd always felt quite inspired by his tenacity and ability to keep moving forward, but initially I thought he was just your typical shonen protagonist.
For the longest time, Itadori Yuji was treated like a placeholder protagonist. Not weak, but not special. Not useless, but not dangerous. Just a vessel. A temporary container for Sukuna until the story moved on to the real monsters of Jujutsu Kaisen. And that perception stuck for years. No cursed technique, no flashy domain, no bloodline hype, just punches, kicks, and pain tolerance. But that narrative doesn't survive anymore. Because right now, Yuji Itadori isn't chasing the top tiers. He's becoming the kind of problem they have to account for. The scariest thing about Yuji's current state isn't that he suddenly unlocked some broken ability. It's that he didn't. He evolved without shortcuts. And in a power system built on cursed techniques, rules, and ceilings, Yuji is quietly breaking the logic of Jujutsu Kaisen itself.
But as I started to look into Jujutsu Kaisen a bit deeper, I realized that there's a lot more to him that I didn't initially appreciate. So now I'm going to do exactly that. And just like the Gojo video, we'll go through in order. It will start anime only, with plenty of warning before any manga spoilers. So going straight into chapter 1, which has a very different post-ending reread feel to any other series that I've seen. And I think a big part of that is because it doesn't start with the main character declaring some kind of goal. Journey beyond the walls, become the greatest striker, stand on the court, become a hunter, become a hero, etc, etc. Instead, it's quite the opposite. Yuji starts with no goals. In fact, he's just kind of aimlessly wasting his time in this occult club, much to his PE teacher's disappointment. But that doesn't really matter to him because he's having a good time. And also, him being in the occult club saved it because it had enough members. And so to him, his actions had significance. It was something only he could do.
Most fans still evaluate Yuji using outdated standards. They look for techniques, domains, lineage, or hacks. But JJK has been slowly telling us something uncomfortable. Raw physical dominance, endurance, and mentality are just as dangerous, if not more, than cursed techniques. And Yuji embodies that truth more than anyone else left in the series.
Clearly, if he wanted to, he could become a professional athlete, but he just doesn't have any interest in that. But then there's obviously the scene with his grandpa dying. There's a consistent theme throughout of Yuji trying to find his place in the world, his purpose in society as such. And I think this is his thirst one, to simply help people, whether they're grateful or not, whether he feels right or he feels lost, just to help people. And the world of Jujutsu makes this a very tough thing to do, as we'll see. In fact, in many cases, his blind desire to help people regardless of the consequences to himself completely backfires. Just as a quick example, in the Shibuya incident, he revolves himself to fight Chozo, no matter what happens to him, as it'd enable his fellow sorcerers to move forward to save Gojo, and his selflessness backfired. As a result, Sukuna was able to reawaken and massacre the city the way he did.
Early Yuji was reckless. He relied on instincts, emotions, and brute force without control. That version of Yuji would get folded by high-tier sorcerers. But current Yuji is different. He doesn't fight like a student. He doesn't fight like a sorcerer. He fights like a curse that learned discipline. Every movement is efficient. Every strike has intent. He doesn't waste motion, and he doesn't hesitate. And hesitation is the real killer in Jujutsu Kaisen. Yuji's physicality has crossed a threshold that most characters can't keep up with anymore. His speed isn't flashy, but it's relentless. His strength isn't explosive, but it's overwhelming. He doesn't rely on one decisive attack. He breaks opponents down piece by piece. That kind of pressure is suffocating, especially in a series where most fighters depend on setting up techniques. What makes this dangerous is that Yuji doesn't give people time. Time is everything in JJK. Time to chant, time to expand a domain, time to calculate cursed energy output. Yuji steals that time. He forces fights into close-range chaos where theory collapses and survival instincts take over. That's where most sorcerers fail. And then there's durability. Yuji's endurance is no longer just impressive. It's abnormal even by JJK standards. He takes punishment that would cripple or kill other characters and keeps advancing. This isn't anime toughness. This is narrative signaling.
way. Obviously, the choice presented to him in die now or eat all the fingers of Sukuna and then die isn't much of a choice. You know, if I asked you if you wanted to die now or die later, it's pretty obvious which one you're going to pick. But regardless, when he speaks to Gojo about it, the main thing that comes up is his grandpa's words. And interestingly, Yuji talks about how he's decided how he's going to die, not decided how he's going to live. My first thought was that this was a very tunnel-visioned perspective from Yuji, not thinking about anything outside of his grandpa's last words. Although I suppose that's not surprising for a grieving young man.
The story keeps reinforcing that Yuji's body is something fundamentally different, not enhanced by a technique, but built for violence. Which brings us to the Sukuna misconception. Many fans believe Yuji lost relevance when Sukuna left his body. They assume Yuji was only dangerous because he housed the King of Curses. But that logic is backwards. Sukuna didn't make Yuji strong. Sukuna refined him. Yuji survived conditions that would have destroyed anyone else. His body adapted. His mind hardened. And now that Sukuna is gone, Yuji is no longer sharing control. That should terrify everyone. Yuji's mentality is his most underrated weapon. He doesn't posture. He doesn't monologue. He doesn't hesitate over morality mid-fight anymore. He accepts violence as necessary. That shift matters. In JJK, conviction determines outcome just as much as power. And Yuji's conviction is absolute. He doesn't fight to prove anything. He fights to end threats. Compare that to other characters who rely on ego, ideals, or spectacle. Yuji strips all of that away. His fights are ugly, direct, and relentless, and that makes them unpredictable.
Sacrifice himself in order to save everyone else, despite his initial confidence, very quickly regrets his decision. He regrets even eating that finger in the first place. The thought of helping people distorts into simply, I don't want to die, I want to run. And he seems to feel quite guilty for thinking that. You know, he's trying to shut all his thoughts out. Again, a completely human train of thought, although one a lot of shonen protagonists do seem to lack, which is something I really appreciate about Yuji. He's got a very good heart. He clearly cares far more for others than himself. He always wants to do the right thing, but he's not some completely unrealistic saint, missing all of these very human thoughts. Anyway, in this fight, he's forced to accept his powerlessness in the world he finds himself in, forced to allow Sukuna to take over in order to save his friends. In addition to being completely overpowered by this special grade curse, he also has to face Sukuna's brutal, unnegotiating nature. But we'll come back to that because whilst in control of Yuji's body, he removes his heart.
This is where the Yuji is a problem argument becomes unavoidable. Yuji doesn't fit cleanly into power scaling charts. He's not the strongest. He's not the fastest. He's not the most hacked. But he exists in a gray area where matchups become uncomfortable. He pressures characters who should theoretically beat him. He survives encounters he shouldn't. And he forces top tiers to adapt on the fly. That's a problem, because JJK's power system was designed to reward specialization. Yuji is a generalist in a world of specialists. And that makes him harder to counter than characters with obvious weaknesses. Let's talk about technique supremacy for a second. Jujutsu Kaisen has spent years teaching fans that cursed techniques define hierarchy, but recent arcs have quietly undermined that idea. Technique reliance creates predictability. Yuji has none. You can't anticipate what he'll activate, because there's nothing to activate. All you get is pressure, and pressure breaks plans. Yuji's combat IQ has also leveled up massively. He reads opponents quickly. He understands spacing, timing, and momentum. He doesn't overcommit. He doesn't chase flashy finishes. He adapts mid-fight in ways that mirror veteran sorcerers rather than students. That evolution matters more than any single power-up. Now let's address the controversial part. Yuji doesn't need a cursed technique to be top tier. That statement alone will make people angry. And that's because it challenges how fans have been trained to evaluate strength. Yuji represents a different archetype, one that prioritizes survivability, consistency, and inevitability over peaks. He doesn't win instantly. He wins eventually. And in a long war, that matters more. Another uncomfortable truth is that Yuji's presence shifts the story's balance. When he enters a fight, the tone changes. Stakes rise. Violence escalates. He doesn't bring hope. he brings consequences. That's not protagonist energy. That's enforcer energy. Yuji feels less like a hero and more like a natural disaster that learned restraint. And that's why he's a problem now. Because problems don't announce themselves. They don't glow. They don't transform. They just keep coming. Even Sukuna's absence doesn't diminish Yuji. It amplifies him. Without Sukuna, Yuji is no longer a ticking bomb waiting to explode. He's a controlled weapon pointed outward. That makes him more reliable and more dangerous. Fans who still see Yuji as mid are clinging to early series impressions. But JJK has moved past that phase. The narrative has shifted from potential to execution. And Yuji is executing. This doesn't mean Yuji beats everyone. That's not the argument. The argument is that Yuji forces fights into uncomfortable territory. He drags opponents out of their comfort zones. He turns theoretical matchups into messy brawls where anything can happen. That unpredictability is lethal. In a world of domains and techniques, Yuji represents something primal. Direct violence, physical dominance, relentless pressure. And the story keeps rewarding that approach. So when people say Yuji is a problem now, they're not exaggerating. They're late. Because Yuji didn't suddenly become dangerous. He always was. You just weren't paying attention.